Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast, and welcome actually to the very last episode in our Youth Leaders Crash Course. We've been seeking to equip youth leaders with wisdom and understanding around young people and sexuality. And we hope it to be helpful to youth leaders listening in. And if you're a youth leader listening and you have found this helpful, please do remember to share this series with other youth leaders you know. Maybe you're listening and you're not a youth leader. We still hope this series has been helpful to you as well and has equipped you to engage well with the young people in your life. So far in this series, we've looked at youth culture and sexuality, we've explored some of the Bible's teaching, talked about pastoral care, and also the important topics of gender and transgender. And today we're going to finish by highlighting one important topic, the topic of mental health. Many of us will be aware of the intersection between sexuality and mental health, and so we want to talk about that a bit. We hope that our conversation will be helpful to you. And I'm thrilled that to help me in this conversation today, I've got my friend and colleague, our Immersion Generations associate, Ashleigh Hull with me. Hello, Ashleigh.
Hello, Andrew.
Is it sunny where you are, Ashleigh?
No, it is miserable and raining.
Oh no!
The heat wave is over. I fear that autumn is coming. I'm not ready.
Oh, well, I was going to say yesterday I thought the heat wave was over, it's returned today, but this evening I'm driving to the Midlands quite near you, so I'm clearly driving away from the heat wave.
Yes, you will be entering the rain cloud, I fear.
Joy. Well, today, Ashleigh, we're talking about mental health, so I want to know, what do you love doing to switch off and to encourage positive mental health?
Yeah, I'm a big old introvert, so find time on my own really refreshing. One of my favourite things to do, when it is sunnier than it is today, is to go camping. So I will go and set up my tent, not quite in the middle of nowhere. I tend to go to a campsite because I'm not that evolved, I guess. And yeah, camp for a couple days and just take my Bible and my journal. So I have my phone is off. I have no one to talk to. I have no distractions. And so I'll sit for half an hour and watch the clouds, and then I'll look at some grass and chat to the Lord about it. It's great. It's a lot of fun.
I didn't know you love camping.
Yeah. Only when it's properly hot though, because I get really cold at night, and that's not fun for me. That does not encourage positive mental health at that point.
Hot and dry. I would say camping's fine as long as you stay dry, because once you get wet, you can't get dry, and then it's just miserable. So I'm a very much fair weather camper, basically. Yeah. I don't mind camping, but it's not my way of dealing or helping my mental health, I don't think. It's often the basic things, isn't it? But they're the good things. I think I've become less introverted actually over the years, and so I think quality time with close friends for me is really just nourishing. Getting out into the natural world, going for walks and stuff. I don't do it as much as I should do, but I'm quite near the beach and near some nice kind of country park type land as well, and it just does me good to get out and take time there. I love music, as is known in this podcast, and so playing the piano, singing a choir and stuff, and all those kind of things I find just are refreshing and recharging for me, certainly.
Good stuff.
Wonderful. Well, it's always good for us all to know ourselves well and know what's good for our encouraging our positive mental health. And today we're going to dive in with a discussion on how we help young people think about their own mental health. So today we're talking about mental health, and for many youth leaders, I'm sure mental health and LGBT matters are probably two of the most prominent challenges in youth ministry. And then sometimes the two of them intersect, and that's why we want to talk about them today. Actually, I think a helpful starting point might just be to briefly touch on some general principles about mental health, which are kind of important for all youth leaders to be aware of, whatever the situation. Ashleigh, could you give us a quick rundown of what you think are the key points about mental health that youth leaders need to know?
Yeah, for sure. I think first thing to say would be that mental health is something that we all have, just like we all have physical health. And it's not a binary. So it's not that you either have good mental health or bad mental health. It's more like a sliding scale. And so you might be anywhere along that scale. I think all of us experience fluctuations and slidings along that scale to different degrees at different times. There might be a whole range of reasons for that. And it's something that each of us needs to be aware of for ourselves and for other people. It's something that's just really helpful and good to talk about and think about. Just how we can stay more mentally healthy ourselves.
It's really helpful. Thank you. Yeah. So mental health is a really important topic and often intersects actually with experiences of sexuality and LGBT plus experiences more broadly. And it's actually really quite widely recognised that mental health problems are more common among LGBT plus people. And so it might be good to speak about our own stories. Our own stories, has mental health been part of our journey of sexuality? What about for yourself, Ashleigh, there? How has mental health been a feature of your story?
Yeah. As you say, I know for a lot of people, their experiences of sexuality and mental health are very intertwined. For some people, their experience of sexuality has a really prominent impact on their mental health. But for me, that's not really my story. So my mental health, it does ebb and flow and swing backwards and forwards. And there are some things that I know, like I know that during the winter, my mood will tend to take a dip, things like that. But none of that has really ever been linked to my sexuality or my same-sex attraction. I've never really had a dark patch that I would link back to my same-sex attraction, or a really good patch that I would link back in the same kind of way. So yeah, for me, the two are quite distinct.
Essentially, mine, I don't know, I mean, so mental health has been a big feature for me. Depression has been quite a feature of my life. Anxiety when I was younger. I've talked probably in this podcast about how much I've benefited from Christian counselling over the last 5 years, particularly just working through a load of stuff. But yeah, likewise, I feel most of my mental health struggles haven't been directly related to or caused by sexuality. But then I'd also say, because sexuality is a real part of human experience and sometimes a significant part, these things all become kind of mixed in. So it's not being irrelevant to my experience of mental health, but has been at play as well. And it's helpful that you said there, actually, there's such diversity here, isn't there? That's just two stories, maybe stories that happen to have a similar experience of sexuality, has some play on mental health but not a big impact. But there'll be some people where it has a much more significant impact. And I think actually that diversity of stories and experiences is really helpful to be important to be aware of.
Absolutely. And as we've said kind of throughout this podcast in various topics, the way to understand that with your young people is to actually ask them for their story, ask them what their experience is like, what kind of things they're going through. That's really the only way you're going to know about that young person, is by asking them. Yeah.
Those conversations are always so important. One of the big questions, I guess, then that comes up is to wrestle with why it is that mental health problems are more common among LGBT plus people. What kind of things do you want to say when people bring that question to you?
Yeah, it's $1 million question. There's actually not a ton of research available on this one. It's quite hard to research it reliably. So there are some limitations there in what we can actually empirically know. Often this is believed to be down to a lot of social stress factors. So the experience of LGBT people within society, if people are feeling rejected or marginalised or unsafe just by existing within their society, that will definitely play a part in someone's mental health. But it doesn't seem to be the whole story. Kind of similar, but on a smaller scale, family rejection can play a part in that. So again, any active rejection by someone's family because of their sexuality, so whether they're thrown out of home or told they're going to bring shame on the family, things like that, again, that can play a part in this intersection between LGBT and mental health. But I would just chuck in on that as well. That's not just a family member has a different perspective to you. So say in a Christian context, a child comes out to their parent and their parent listens well, but maybe has a different view on what the Bible has to say about it. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about very active rejection, as I say, throwing someone out of a home, for example, or whatever that might be.
Yeah, that's a very important distinction. Yeah, it's been made particularly by the Family Acceptance Project, a load of research led by Caitlin Ryan and some other scholars, saying that yes, family rejection is an issue, but that doesn't mean theological disagreement. That means things which are utterly unchristian, like, yes, rejecting your child, tracking them out of home and such like. A couple other things I found very striking when I did a bit of research into this. One proposal for a potential influencing factor is there's a sad reality that there are higher rates of having experienced sexual abuse among LGBT plus people. And we do know that experiencing sexual abuse is a potential contributor to mental ill health. And so that there's correlation there, which could be a contributing factor. And also some people, it's a controversial point, but some people do think there is some evidence of a potential genetic predisposition among certain LGBT people towards mental ill health. All of which kind of shows there are lots of things that could influence. Probably all of them have some influence, but it's not at all clear-cut. And as you say, very hard to research. We've actually got an article that I wrote called LGBT and Mental Health, What's the Link? Where I'm kind of exploring some of that research. I try to take into serious consideration the kind of methodologies which help us think how reliable, how representative is the research and stuff, and try and make that case of, all these things seem to potentially be at play, but actually no single thing explains the question overall. Another big question I think that then comes up, particularly in our context, is people ask kind of the question of, well, is it that this Christian sexual ethic, the traditional ethic that we would teach, does that cause or exasperate mental health problems among LGBT plus people? And again, a question we want to hear and take seriously and wrestle with. Again, something I've looked into and wrestled with. It's a similar situation of there's very little reliable research. These things just are very hard to conduct reliable studies in. And it's a question that few people come to with a kind of unbiased starting point. So also we've got to consider, is this research fair and helpful? The things that were striking when I looked into that were, again, very active family rejection from a Christian context can be something that contributes to mental ill health, but that's different from just having a different theological perspective. There also seems to be some evidence that forcing people into conversion therapy, so things which they're promised will change their experience of sexuality, there's evidence that forcing people into that can be harmful. More, it seems, the forcing than the things they actually go through. That's one of the reasons why we as Living Out don't support conversion therapy. We don't feel it's necessary for Christian faithfulness, and we've written about that on the website. But other than those two things, there's no real evidence that actually traditional Christian teaching adds to the reality of mental health among LGBT plus people.
Yeah, and it shouldn't need to. If we think about what we're actually talking about when we talk about a Christian framework for sexuality, often the trap people will come down with this is talking about how people are having to repress who they really are. They're having to ignore their true identity. But we know from a Christian perspective that sexuality and gender, those things are not our identity. That as we follow Jesus, we're actually embracing our true identity rather than repressing it. Or people might talk about intimacy and how if someone is not acting on their sexual desires, then they're being denied intimacy, and of course that's gonna exacerbate mental health problems. But that's not actually what we're saying as Christians. Sex and romance are not intimacy. They can be roots of intimacy, but they're not the only way in which we can experience intimacy as Christians. Just friendship is a context where you can have genuine connection, genuine intimacy. Church community is a place where you can be fully known and yet fully loved. And so all these different things, the experience of the Christian life should actually help to improve our mental health rather than exacerbate mental health problems.
Yeah, and I think if we think that Christian teaching might influence or create mental health problems, we should ask the question why, and then what can we do about that? Because chances are we're not living out the fullness of God's teaching if that is actually reality. I think you're so right. I like the thing, it shouldn't need to be the case, and it shouldn't be the case. So how do we make sure it's not? One thing I wanted to say a note on just before closing this half of the podcast is just a note on the important and complex topic of suicide. Sometimes the claim is made that Christian teaching leads particularly LGBT plus teenagers to suicide, and just two things I wanted to note on that. One is, I think often suicide is talked about kind of very irresponsibly in this conversation. If you listen to people like the Samaritans, a UK charity who are kind of the experts in suicide prevention, they warn against speculating about the causes of suicide. They note helpfully that it's always a complex phenomenon, never a single cause at play. And they also warn us against publicly speculating about causes of suicide. That's particularly because we know that suicide is a contagious idea, especially among young people. Especially there's good research showing that actually if you tell a young person that they are impacted by something which increases their likelihood of contemplating or committing suicide, that actually increases the possibility that will become a thought in their mind and they might take actions. And so it's actually very irresponsible to be telling young people that certain individual things increase their risk of suicide. And so I think we need to be very careful about how we talk about suicide in this conversation. And the way that suicide is often weaponized against traditional Christian teaching is actually deeply irresponsible in terms of caring for young people. So there's one thing there about the fact that it's a risk we talk about it irresponsibly. It's also important just to note that the claim that Christian teaching leads young people to suicide around these topics just isn't supported by evidence. The claim is often made especially on gender. Actually, just in general, not affirming someone's gender identity is dangerous to them. That's based on studies with very poor quality data and really is an unsubstantiated claim. There are, it's true, among trans-identifying young people, some commonly occurring factors that can be risk factors for suicide. Things like mental health, and that's a reason to take those factors very seriously, but that's not actually about trans-identification or gender questioning in and of itself. And again, it's unhelpful and irresponsible to suggest that actually that is a particular risk factor. Some resources if people might want to think about this more. An article from me called LGBTQ plus suicide on our website where I look at some of the research. A fantastic website called Stats for Gender, statsforgender.org, which summarises reliable peer-reviewed research on gender, and they've got a whole section on suicide. And a final one from Transgender Trend, a secular organisation engaging with the reality of trans identification among young people, just an article called Suicide, Facts and Myths, where they talk about the key studies often used to make these claims and show that actually they're not really, that conclusion is not really followed or supported by the data. We'll stick links to all of those and to other helpful resources in the show notes.
If you're enjoying this podcast series, then you'll love our Youth Leader Network. It exists to help youth leaders as they help young people wrestle with questions about faith and sexuality. It's free to join, it's really easy to sign up on our website. And members of the network receive the Youth Leader Network newsletter in email and video formats. Each edition points you to plenty of useful resources and events, as well as sharing news about the network as it grows and develops. You're also invited to submit your own questions, and some of those will be discussed in our Youth Leader Q&A videos. And there's also a private Instagram channel where we post Youth Leader Network updates. So go to the website livingout.org/youth-leaders and click the button to sign up.
So we've talked about understanding, and now we're going to think about responding. How do we help and support young people who may be struggling with their mental health? Ashleigh, you're an experienced youth leader. Help us out here. What wisdom do you have for us on how we support young people in these situations?
Recognising that this suffering is real. It may not be something that we can see the way we'd see a broken arm, but people are genuinely in a lot of pain in some cases. And so just responding to that with compassion, listening to them, asking good questions, all the kind of things that we've already covered in previous episodes when we're talking about conversations with young people, encouraging them to talk about it if they can. So often with these things, you can feel very alone. And so actually talking with somebody else about it, even just knowing that someone else out there in the world knows what you're going through, or maybe someone else, the person you happen to talk to, actually has a similar experience to you, makes you feel a lot less alone. So even just that, just having those conversations with them it can have a far bigger impact than we realise. I would also say that I think sometimes as youth leaders we can feel like it's our job to be everything, and we don't have to be, and in some cases we can't be. So often I would feel quite ill-equipped as a youth leader to actually help my young people where they have got more serious stuff going on, and just came to realise I am not equipped to deal with that, and it's not my job to. Like, yes, I want to listen well, and yes, I want to know what's going on with them and love them, but I can also signpost them to maybe people who actually are professionally more qualified and more able to support. So do think about that. Maybe encourage them to use maybe just wider church pastoral structures if those are appropriate. Things like medication and counselling can be so helpful, although it's worth just pointing out that counsellors are human beings too and have their own perspectives on things. And so just worth being aware of the kind of things that these counsellors might end up saying to your young people. But things like that can be so helpful. I'll chuck in a couple of resources as well that we have found useful at various points. So there is a website called beheadstrong.uk. That's a resource from Youthscape. It is packed with mental and emotional well-being information, strategies. It's all aimed at young people. And so they can go there just to learn about what is going on with them or their friends, or actually to find practical tools to help them in that. One of those tools is called Illumina. That's a course that we ran at my group. They run it online as well. And that is for those specifically who are struggling with self-harm. And a lot of our young people found that really helpful. Again, just in understanding why they're doing what they're doing and how they can find different and healthier coping strategies and things like that. And then, of course, there's mind.org.uk, which is a national mental health charity and has some stuff directed at young people specifically as well.
excellent resource as well worth looking at. I love what you said there about, because you mentioned, sometimes we feel out of our depth and it's okay to reach out for other forms of support and direct people other directions. And I find myself wanting to simultaneously say two things to people in pastoral ministry, often including youth leaders. One is to say that, yes, sometimes we are out of our depth and it's right and there's nothing wrong with us seeking the aid of others and pointing people other directions, but also wanted to reassure people often we're more equipped to help others than we think we are. And particularly like mental health, in the same way that like sexuality, we just get scared off by it, just the mention of the topic. But actually, if you are just a caring human being, and certainly you have any experience of caring for people in pastoring, you've got lots of good common sense and lots of good wisdom already to bring. And it might be a combination of you and some other professional support might be what's needed. But I want to simultaneously say this thing of don't be scared off and underestimate what you do have to offer. But also it's okay when you realise actually someone else or something else needs to be brought in to support as well. Kind of finding that balance is really key. And I guess the final question we might want to ask is, we are coming from this from a uniquely Christian perspective. So what do we uniquely have to offer as Christians when it comes to the question of mental health? How does Jesus and how does the gospel offer us help in our mental health?
Do you know what? The gospel is the only thing I have ever found that actually gives me a framework for understanding and living with suffering. It's just the best and only answer. And we understand why the world is the way it is, and that things are broken and not as they're meant to be. And we are living in this kind of period before Jesus comes back when we are still going to suffer, but that God is with us and God is working in it. And I find that personally so helpful, just kind of when I'm in the midst of something, going, even though I cannot see what God is doing here, even if perhaps I cannot wrap my head around how he could possibly bring something good out of this situation, I know what he's like and I know that he can. And so, just the gospel provides that kind of perspective and that kind of hope, and that not an answer in a like equation X plus Y equals Z sort of way, but it gives you at least the beginnings of an answer and a way to understand why you're going through some of the things that you are.
I found in my own wrestling with mental health just how the gospel and biblical truth is the thing which so often can break into the things that are underlying our problems. Actually, so often mental health is because we're believing lies and we're struggling to believe truth. That can certainly be true around shame and different things like that. And actually it's in the gospel and it's the glorious truth revealed to us in the Bible that we can find freedom from those things. And it's important to note, I think often that's not a kind of, you read a verse and it's all sorted. Actually, it's something that's really taking hold of and battling truth. I know some of my battles with kind of my self-image and my identity, which was really negatively impacting my mental health. Actually, it was a journey of weeks and sometimes months wrestling with taking hold of biblical truth, pushing it deeper into my heart. But gradually, it really did begin to make a difference. And so I think one of just the great ways that the gospel and the goodness of Jesus helps us is we know truth, we know that we're loved, we know that we're accepted, all these kind of things, which can gradually unpick some of the harmful lies that can bind us, I guess, and can bring us into wonderful freedom.
Yeah. It gives us immense hope as well. Just think the future that is promised in the gospel, in the Bible. We know where we're going. We know that someday there will be no more death or sorrow or suffering or pain, that God will wipe every tear from our eyes, that we're going to live with him forever in kind of this perfect world, this world redeemed and made how it was always meant to be. And so, again, just this incredible hope that we have to offer as Christians that you can't find anywhere else.
Yeah, helping young people to have an eternal perspective is so key, so hard when we're living in instant access culture and it feels for them like life, they've got so much life left and hopefully they have, but it is so important for us to have that eternal perspective. And one final thing that comes to mind for me is just thinking on Jesus, God become man, the one who has suffered, who understands suffering. He gets it, he understands it from the inside out, not as a kind of outward or a looker looking on from outward, not really able to understand it, but one who has experienced the ups and downs of human life. But then the wonderful thing of then he now simultaneously by his spirit is living with us, inside of us, the God of all comfort. And so he's able to offer comfort, encouragement, he's able to sympathize with us in those weaknesses. And just thinking on the person of Jesus that he understands and he now always dwells with us is really helpful. I think that's a really powerful thing to say to a teenager. I love saying to a teenager, well, have you ever thought about the fact Jesus was a teenager? He went through the kind of thing. He knew what peer pressure was like. He knew the ups and downs of puberty. He knew all these different kind of things. He really gets what you're going through. And there's something wonderfully powerful and comforting and reassuring, I think, about that. Let's just mention a few resources if you want to explore this further. It's being a brief discussion of a big topic. We've mentioned some already. One more article that I've written we haven't mentioned so far is a Christian perspective on LGBTQ plus mental health, which is kind of more of that general introduction to how do we think well about mental health. We've talked in another podcast episode back in our Questions No One Wants to Answer series about mental health. The question being, does Christian teaching cause LGBT mental health problems? Further expanding on that question we talked about earlier. And we've got an article from two scholars over in the States. The article is called The Mental Health and Wellbeing of Celibate Gay Christians, which actually is reflecting on some research into mental well-being among people who are followers of Jesus, seeking to live out biblical teaching, but are also attracted to people of the same sex. Some interesting findings in that research and some helpful kind of practical reflections on the basis of it. Ashleigh, we've been offering discussion questions to youth teams on the basis of each of these episodes. What are the discussion questions for today's episode?
3 of them today. So question 1, do we have a good understanding of the main mental health issues that our teens might be struggling with? So that might be things like depression and anxiety, maybe suicidality, as we talked about, or just low self-esteem, self-worth, things like eating disorders can play into that. Those kind of areas of things. Do we have a good understanding of those main mental health issues? And if not, what is our next step in learning? Question 2, how can we provide a safe environment for teens to be honest about their pains and their struggles? And then question 3, what practical things or resources should we put in place to equip us as a team and to help any youth? So, for example, a member of my youth team did us a massive favour, I was going to say, but it was even more than that. She did a bunch of research. She created a document that just really briefly, it was kind of a page on each. She looked at various mental health issues that people might have and just provided some quick information and some resources for helping with each of those. So that might be something that you as an individual or as a team would find helpful to pull together. Just practical things in place for when you need them.
That's a great idea, isn't it? And since it's the last episode of the series, we'll also give you a few questions. If you want to look back over all the episodes and think big picture, you might want to discuss these as a team as well. So 3 quick questions. One would be, what are your key takeaways from having listened to and reflected on this series? What should you be continuing to pray about on the basis of what we've been thinking about and learning about? And what's your priority to do next? What are the next steps for you as a youth leader, for you as a youth team? All of those questions and the recommended resources will stick in the show notes below and also on the webpage that accompanies this series, which is just livingout.org/YLCC, Youth Leaders Crash Course. As part of this series, we've been featuring a few short conversations with special guests. And today we're going to finish with a quick conversation with friend of Living Out, Preston Sprinkle. So let's have a listen to that conversation. I'm really pleased to be joined today by a friend of Living Out, a previous podcast guest, Preston Sprinkle. Preston, thanks so much for joining us. I imagine many of our listeners will already know who you are, but for anyone who doesn't, could you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work in the area of sexuality?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, for having me on. It's always good to see you, even from a distance. Yeah, I've been engaging questions around sexuality and gender for about 10 years now. And it's been my full-time job for about 7 years. I run an organization very similar to Living Out. I like to call us informal, sister organizations. The one I help run is the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. We help resource the church, especially church leaders, on questions around sexuality and gender. I sort of fell into the conversation as a curious biblical scholar. I was a professor at a Christian school and was just interested in the question of what does the Bible say about sexuality, and later I started wrestling more with gender identity questions. So I like to say I began as just a curious biblical scholar, but very early on I just saw there were so many pastoral needs in the conversation, and a lot of mistakes churches made in the conversation. So I kind of I have my theological hat on sometimes, and sometimes my pastoral hat, and I'm trying to blend those together because I don't think they should be separated. So yeah, that's
brilliant.
my 10 years in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, so with that 10 years of experience then and those kind of two hats on, what have you learned about handling sexuality and gender well, particularly when working with young people? What do you think is useful for youth leaders to know and think about?
Yeah, man. Everybody comes at these questions with some kind of story, some kind of presupposition, some kind of personal assumptions, and not just people who are same-sex attracted, but a lot of people come at the conversation with sometimes some baggage, sometimes some fears. So I think the number one piece of advice is when you're talking about this topic to, I would say anybody, but younger people, included. Just be really sensitive to the various stories that people are bringing to that conversation. And so this leads to, I guess, my number one piece of advice of anybody, especially if somebody is straight, be a curious listener. Be a curious listener. Be curious about somebody else's story. Be curious about just the conversation as a whole. Don't be quick to make, assumptions about what you think Like early on in my journey, I feel like every time I felt like I got a really good handle on the conversation, I would talk to somebody and they would just blow my categories apart. I'm like, oh my gosh, like I really have a lot to learn. Even today, I'll say something and someone's like, well, actually, when you say that, it sends this kind of signal. I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I'm doing that. So, the conversation is very sensitive, can be very volatile, and it can be very complex too. So I think, appreciating the complexity of the conversation, complexity of human beings coming into the conversation is a good place to start.
Yeah, so good. And I love actually the way you always talk about this as a conversation. And, as youth leaders, there's absolutely a place where we want to declare truth, teach truth, but also doing that in the context of conversation is so helpful, isn't it? Connecting with real people. And I think, you're right, listening there is so important. And you mentioned there just that, particularly learning as someone who isn't yourself same-sex attracted. Any wisdom for youth leaders, many of whom might be thinking, well, I've not had different experiences of sexuality or gender. Kind of how can I speak into this? Anything specific to help and encourage people who come not from personal experience but still want to serve well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do. Okay, so I would say publicly, I get that critique. What are you doing in this conversation? You're a straight white guy. You're married. You have no, oftentimes it's a critical. You have no business, doing this. Speaking into something you know nothing about. But behind the scenes, I get an overwhelming majority of typically same-sex attracted Christians, usually from guys, saying, thank you so much. Because the fact that they'll say the fact that you're straight means even more, because first of all, you're able to speak to the church in ways that maybe will be heard better by the majority of leaders in the church who are straight, and just the fact that somebody who doesn't have this experience, or maybe we can all even call it a burden sometimes, the fact that you're still taking the time to learn, to grow, to be curious, to speak into it, that means a lot, because you don't, in the sense that you don't have to do this, you can do something else. So all that to say, I would encourage straight youth leaders to don't feel like just because you're straight you have no role to play. Don't claim to know everybody's experience, which hopefully that goes without saying. Don't pretend like you know what it's like to experience same-sex attraction, but don't shrink back from engage in the conversation. I would say this though, make sure you do educate yourself before you start speaking into it. Let the volume of your voice match the depth of your study. If you haven't studied much, then be more humble and very cautious with your approach, and when I say study, I don't just mean reading books. I think that's a big part of it. There is a lot of theological and relational things you can learn from books for sure. But also learn from people, study people, be a good listener, be a curious listener, be a student of people's experiences. So in this day and age, I mean, silence is not an option. For if youth pastors out there, here's my one, like maybe my Americanism is going to come out here. I'm going to say something really bold, and silence is just not an option. I mean, our youth are swimming in the deep end of this conversation, and if we claim to be called to pastor, to disciple the next generation, silence is not an option. We can't say, I'm just not going to touch this topic. So yes, engage it, but engage it well. Get yourself educated. Learn, read, listen, before and as you continue to engage it.
But that's really great wisdom. Thank you. And the final thing I wanted to talk to you about, you've just released a new book, which I had the privilege of reading early days, and I think it's a great resource for youth leaders. Just quickly tell us a quick brief overview of what that book's about and why it's helpful to youth leaders.
Yeah, it's called Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? I don't often do this, but it's right here. So here's the title right here. 21 Conversations from a Historically Christian View. The book basically is responding to the top arguments against traditional marriage or for, same-sex sexual relationships. A lot of these arguments use biblical passages. They'll go to the Bible to say, here's why the traditional view is wrong. And some of their arguments are quite compelling and have a lot of research behind them. And some of them are, less, they're more maybe arise out of an emotional, need. Others are very theologically sophisticated. So this book is basically a compilation of all the top questions that I've gotten over the last decade or so. Whenever I go speak and, I get, or do a Q&A, I get tons of questions and pushback sometimes, So this book is kind of a one-stop shop to address what I think are the top 21 arguments for same-sex marriage. I also begin the book by talking about how to even have a profitable conversation. Honestly, I don't know if I told you this, Andrew. It's probably my favorite chapter in the book, if I can single out a favorite chapter, because it applies to kind of everything in our polarized society, especially in the U.S. context. Political polarization is just destroying the church, and we don't know how to even talk across different political opinions. I think you Brits are better at that than we are. We can definitely learn from you. But so I mean, we should be a curious listener across different viewpoints. We should seek to understand before we refute. We should find some common ground. Like, even with a lot of these arguments, like there's aspects of the arguments that I think make a good point, and it's okay to acknowledge that. It shows that you're a genuine seeker, you're a genuine learner. So anyway, I talk about kind of principles of how to go about having a profitable conversation, and then I get into addressing the 21 arguments.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that opening chapter is so helpful. Actually, we need to think about how we have good conversations. And what I love about the book is then you model that so well as you go through those 21 conversations. And I think as a model of how to engage, well, it's a model of how to engage in conversation, but also from a teaching kind of position. I think that will be just hugely helpful for youth leaders. So I'll just greatly commend that book to people listening. It's going to be a great resource to us. Well, these are only quick conversations, sadly, so we're kind of out of time, but thanks so much, Preston. We'll stick links to Preston's new book and also different things he's written for us in the show notes, and we'll also link to the Centre for Faith, Sexuality and Gender that Preston works at as well. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks so much to Preston. Thank you, Ashleigh, for joining me, and thank you to you for listening. We really hope that you found this series helpful. If you have, please do consider sharing it with other people. Might be youth leaders, might be other people who are engaging with teenagers and young people. You think this would be beneficial for them. And also don't forget to join our Youth Leader Network. That's a way of getting more resources from us and training for you in your role working with teenagers. We'll be back in a few weeks' time. We're launching a new series called Bible Encouragements. Something a bit different this time, where we'll be sharing some of the Bible passages that have been an encouragement to us. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. We really look forward to having you join us then. Bye for now.